and he came to you and he said, "Oh, like I need some drone shields to protect us against the aliens." Would you guys develop something for them? No, I'm just saying.
Alien threats. Yeah, well, who knows? I mean, it's an interesting situation. You have you. I mean, we live in a world where thing about improvised threats is often that you need to build a system that is so resilient that it can manage the threats which occurred so far, but then teach itself as new threats emerge to
Absolutely.
be sort of that have future proof requirement. And also that's part of the military's mindset where they invest in you in the long term. So a lot of it is not just, well, where are you now, but also do you have ability to be in 10, 20 years from now where they want you to be.
Yeah, autonomy is definitely one of the key things, right? Like you want it to be independent as much as possible and give you the output or the outcomes that you want without any human interference. And that's why I kind of touch on AI because I feel like this is absolutely where the game is in terms of um, being able to make sense of the data in the best way possible. And today I got a very interesting gentleman, someone who I met on LinkedIn a couple of weeks ago. Oleg Vornik. I got it right.
Thanks for having me, Rani.
Amazing. So you guys do some really interesting stuff. So um, Drone Shields is the company that you run and manage, and you guys do some really interesting stuff. I was looking at the website. I was like, wow, I didn't even know that technology exists. So it's a pleasure to have you on the show.
Glad to be here.
Amazing. So, I guess we got a ton of things to talk about today. And um, where do we start? Like, how did that journey for you start? Like, so I guess you've been working in the company for quite some time now. How many years?
About 5 years now. So the business is about 6 years old. I think I was about a third employee in the business,
Wow.
first one in Australia. So it actually began as a US company, and then we gradually became more and more Australianized as additional hires came on board here in Sydney, and now we're about 40 odd people with 30 plus out of that in Australia, and then we got a few in the US, which is really our sales and marketing office now, and then a couple in the UK.
Wow. Okay. So you guys have grown quite considerably over the last few years. And is the focus and the market of focus in, primarily in Australia, or are you guys also looking at other key markets?
So maybe first a little bit about our history. So
Yeah.
we're a counter UAS company that is now expanding into surrounding areas of electronic warfare, RF sensing, sensor fusion, artificial intelligence applied to RF, optical, and other spectrum and other similar fields. When we started as a counter UAS or counter drone company, people often say to us, "Well, you guys are crazy." And you look back 5 years ago, and
Yeah.
a drone, if you try to do something bad with it, will probably fly 50 meters, smack against the nearest tree, and that'll be the end of it. You wouldn't be able to do anything
Right. Yes.
wrong with it. So we had a vision where we said, just wait, the technology will continue to develop, the payloads will get better, flight times will get better, navigation, etc. So with time, you'll be able to use drones to conduct all kinds of nefarious acts, whether it's terrorism or delivery of contraband into prisons or flying UAS around airports and creating danger for aircraft and so forth. Uh, our first technology was acoustics, using acoustics to detect a drone. So often, say you might be um, at a beach, and the first time you would detect a drone would normally be you hearing it. You would hear that
Correct.
kind of a buzzing noise, and you look up and you see a
Yeah.
drone. And we thought, well, this is something that a machine could do as well. So we built these highly sensitive microphones and had software kind of at the back end of it, analyzing it just like a human would to detect a drone. And we had some good initial amount of success. So we got deployed by Boston Police at Boston Marathon, and sort of grew from there. Then the company went through public listing on ASX. So we listed in mid 2016. That gave us funds to really grow as a business and
Yeah.
invest in both R&D and sales teams. So we at that point were about 10 or 12 people. Then as we continue seeing increase in nefarious use of drones, we had all these people come to us, militaries, law enforcement, critical infrastructure, etc., around the world, saying, "Hey, we have this problem." Because we were really one of the pioneers when we started doing this. There might have been maybe one other company doing counter drone.
Right.
Now there are a lot, but we're still the original counter drone company based here in Australia. So the business started as a export business because drones were not as much of a threat in Australia at the time
Mm.
compared to what they were doing with ISIS in the Middle East,
Yeah.
or all the incidents taking place in the US. So we started as an export business, selling to a range of countries. So today we sell to about 100 countries around the world, and then started turning our gaze back into Australia. So as Australian military and other government agencies started getting interested in the topic as the threat of drones came here,
Mm.
we deployed with Queensland Police at the Commonwealth Games. That was about 2 years ago. We had our first contract with the Australian military about 2 years ago as well. Now we have a few, and it kind of grew from there. So in a way, reverse to what you normally have, where you sell locally first and then you export. We sort of started as an exporter and now turning to be a local supplier.
Amazing. I'm always excited when I see an Australian company doing really well outside Australia too. So, what kind of, I think maybe we should start, like you said, from the very beginning. So, what kind of like inspired the idea itself? And I'm not sure, were you one of the founders or?
I was not one of the original two founders, but I was
Sure.
right the
Right.
next person. So I was fairly, I guess you can say, in the weeds in terms of building the company
Yeah.
to what it is today. In terms of inspiration, look, as I was saying, because I wasn't one of the two founders, I think these things often just come through brainstorming, and you try
Yeah.
and experience a whole lot of
You're sitting one
things.
day and you're just
Uh,
scratching your head and you're having a beer. You're like,
yeah,
hmm. Or maybe you're sitting at the beach and you see a drone. You're like, oh.
I get a little frustrated with the whole kind of worship of founders and ideas generally. I actually think I mean, nothing is simple, but it's a simpler task to start something and come up with the idea. I think it's much harder to take it as a kernel of an idea in a business and actually grow into
And
a
execute it.
fledgling company. Yeah, execution I think is much harder than creating ideas.
100%. There's thousands, millions, and hundreds of millions of ideas out there, and that's one of the things I'm super big on. Like I always say, probably not so much like on social media, although I'm sure I've posted about it a couple of times. But execution is what separates, companies from, or successful companies from not successful companies, or from $1 billion company to a company that didn't make it through. It's all about execution. A classic example is Facebook, for example, versus
MySpace,
MySpace. You
totally,
know,
totally.
it was execution. The idea was there. There were at least 5 or 6 social network platforms already there, but execution, was the main thing. Um, so you're spot on that. So I guess what you guys do today is quite, like I said, not only interesting, but has different applications in different industries and sectors. I know you guys, one of the main sectors that you focus on is military and defense, but there's also other scopes and industries that you work with. So maybe we can dive into a little bit about into the military and defense sector, because I think that's pretty cool.
It is most interesting. And also, one thing I've learned pretty early on is that you have to separate in business between the need and ability to get something. So, for
Mm,
example, prisons have dire need for our products, but they generally find it much harder to get the budget when there's the need.
mm.
While militaries is one sector where generally when there's requirement, there is money to fulfill that
They
requirement.
always manage to find the money. Hey,
That's right.
yeah, cool. So you guys have been working in that sector for quite like some time. Have you seen any trend in terms of what the requirements and needs that the military or the defense organizations, not just in Australia but all around the world, are having over the last few years, and how did that shape the product and offering and the technology that you guys work on?
Improvised threats are something that probably came to the fore with counter IEDs or the roadside bombs that
Mm,
coalition forces first encountered in Afghanistan, Iraq, and other places in the Middle East, and that was sort of the first real situation where you take some very well equipped militaries, and then you have terrorists
mm,
effectively who use very low budget weapons to provide very meaningful resistance. And you kind of say, well, you can't devote many millions of dollars to protect yourself against something that costs you $1,000 to create, because you just cannot keep fighting that kind of war. So counter or drones themselves, they're not necessarily a new threat, but they are a new method of delivering dangerous payloads. That's kind of a
right,
way to think about it. So a flying roadside bomb or a flying camera. So I would call it, rather than a new threat, a new method of delivery of a threat.
right.
And militaries are a really interesting customer, very different to consumer market, where they're a very loyal customer. They really invest in the long term working with their suppliers.
Yep.
But on the flip side, the lead time is quite considerably longer. It's not, you put your products online, you advertise it on Instagram, and you start
Boom,
making
the next day
sales.
you're selling. Yeah.
Yeah. So part of it is militaries invest time in actually doing due diligence on you as a supplier, and there's obviously a high degree of trust on a number of fronts. And some of it is the fact that you're putting your products in hands of people who are in very dangerous situations.
Mm,
They say that defense and medical are probably two of the most, you can say, two of the most
critical,
I suppose, yeah, critical. Like, they're kind of situations where if the
risky.
product doesn't work,
Yeah.
people can die.
Yeah.
And that's kind of different to say, if you have piece of software, I mean, if your Windows crashes, it's inconvenient, but nobody dies generally.
Yeah.
uh,
Yeah.
a bit different if you have a drone coming at you and you thought you have something that can take it down, but it doesn't, and then consequences can be pretty grave.
Yeah.
So it takes a while to start working with the military customers. There's a high degree of trust. When you scale the problem, so when you scale your solution, you can't just kind of come into the country and say, hey, we want to sell to French military or Middle Eastern militaries. You have to find the right channels, and that's a big
Yeah.
part of the equation as well. So today we sell through our own teams, but also in-country partners, both in Australia and the US, because we have teams in both.
Mm.
Virtually everywhere else, we sell through trusted in-country partners, and it took us years to build those partnerships. And sometimes
Are they, sorry to interrupt, are they like representatives?
they're like in-country agents. So you kind of say, well, what does it take to have a successful in-country agent? And often you have to try several agents before
Yeah.
it works out. So sometimes it'll be people who might sell adjacent products. By adjacent, it can mean selling drones themselves to the militaries, or it can mean selling same kind of budget range, same kind of type of customer groups. So maybe they sell firearms, or maybe they sell sensors like radars for other things unrelated to drones. So they already speak the lingo, have the right relationships, understand the
Right.
tendering processes. So then you try to plug into those distributors, and they have to buy into you as much as you buy into them, because they have to trust your product
Of course.
as well.
Yeah, because they're putting the reputation on
because
them.
they're putting the reputation. Yeah, that's right. The other thing to keep in mind is, so when a lot of our customers first make a purchase of counter-drone products, this is the very first time they purchased counter-drone products.
Yep.
So for them, there's this degree of uncertainty. Well, what am I really buying? Is it going to solve my problem? Over time, this is becoming easier because you're saying, well, I now sold to customers X, Y, and Z. If it was good enough for them, it'll be good enough for you. But in the early days, it was certainly much harder to get the ball rolling. So often you start with smaller sales, kind of onesies and twoies. You sort of $50,000 sale, $100,000 sale,
Right.
and then you move into kind of $1 million, $2 million sales, and then come more like 10, 20,
Right.
30 million plus kind of sales. So it takes time, but then once you're there, you are a trusted supplier. There's no reason for, and there's no desire by those customers to sort of shop around every time. It's not just about who's the cheapest, but who has the products that you can trust. So that's kind of the upside, that kind of moat around your business. You build it as you go.
Wow. So much interesting stuff in what you just said. So I have a question. What you guys like the products that you sell? Do you have patents on them? Is there any intellectual property with the technology and the products that you make?
There's a high degree of R&D that goes into our product. So about 30 out of 40 of our team are engineers. And by engineers, I mean hardware, software, product designers, our manufacturing guys. The manufacturing itself is also fairly high tech.
Yeah.
And with it, of course, come all the IP. Now, the stance we take on this is we patent some of it and we keep some of it as trade secrets. The reason for that is when you patent something, you have to disclose the secret.
Of course.
Same reason why Coke, I guess, doesn't patent its recipe.
Yeah.
So
yeah,
there are a lot of bad guys out there who would want to then read your recipe
of course,
and try to recreate this or try to create something that renders your product somehow ineffective based on the recipe they read.
to beat it.
So yes, so often you find that in our space and defense, there are a lot of trade secrets rather than patents because people have reluctance to divulge what how things are made.
Wow. So is that from a security protection measure or from also a commercial perspective?
It's both.
Both.
It's both in this case.
Interesting. Because I understand, like, obviously, I'm not very well versed in intellectual property, but I know a few things. And I understand that when it comes to getting a patent, a lot of the software technology cannot be, right? You cannot get patent on that. It's where you have engineering, like, you came up with a device that does something that nothing else does. But even that is, you go into the details of, well, is there anything else? For example, if Tesla is a car at the end of the day. So the patent, if they would to file, I don't know if they have, but they can't just go and say, we want to file for a patent on the car, because the cars have been around for a long time. So what you end up getting a patent on is that extra, that innovation that you came up with, which could be like 5% of what this product is. But you're saying there's a lot of trade secrets. So that's really interesting. So is that also on the hardware as well as the software?
Yeah. So for example, you look at our drone effectors or devices that neutralize drones once our sensors detect them. So a drone effector has several parts to it, and one part is what generates the signal that defeats or overwhelms the drone. But then once you generated that signal and you sort of pass it through all the filters and all the other complex things we have, you have to fire the signal with something. And waveforms, which is the fancy word for antenna, is how you use it. So design of those waveforms is something that, for example, we do patent because it's something that is relatively easier compared to, say, software for the adversary to deconstruct if they happen to take possession of our equipment. And by the way, our equipment is all defense export control, so we sell it in a very careful manner to approved purchases and handle it accordingly. But let's say if you happen to take the device, yes, you could see the antenna technically, and that's one of the reasons also that we patent it. And like you say, it's hardware rather than software. Software is also interesting concept where I think there are different ways to frame it. You can have unique algorithms inside software that could potentially be more patentable than general software.
I was going to get to that. So, one of the things that you guys use in your software obviously is AI technology, right? Be it understanding objects, for example, but also machine learning algorithm. So this is where a lot of the trade secrets come in, I'm assuming.
Yeah. So I think AI is very much a flavor of the day, right? Everybody talks about AI and machine learning. And maybe the first thing to say is that sometimes AI is not the best thing, and just a good old fashioned normal software program will beat AI in a lot of situations any day of the week. You don't always have to, use a bazooka to kill an ant kind of thing. Once you go into AI, it gives you an interesting tool of taking a lot of data and seeing trends in a much faster way than if a human would try to make sense of it. Sure. So when you are in counter drone, we often compare to like a antivirus kind of situation where new improvised threats come out all the time, and you're saying, okay, well, can I take data from my sensors and analyze it in a quick manner and have the system almost, not to sound like a Terminator movie, but for the system to become self-aware, so sort of looks at stuff and teaches itself what a threat might be, and then learn to respond to that. So we have a lot of interest from special operations forces around the world who are saying, well, this is really interesting, but we want, well, the initial thing is, well, can we get updates really frequently in terms of the databases? But then often they're like, well, we're in these unique situations where we want to just deploy the system and for the system to learn in the field. By the way, we don't necessarily want to share the data either. We just want the system to learn and keep it to ourselves because of the unique things that it has seen. So AI enables you to start looking at all of those problem sets.
So just to reiterate what you said, you don't want to be like, let's say I'm a customer, defense organization in country X, and I've purchased 50 of your products and your drone shields, and they're out there doing their job, and they're also collecting all this information. I do not want this data to be shared with anyone, including you guys, but I want a system or a software that uses and utilizes that data to be able to self-teach itself, that's the word, to understand and learn more about all the other threats that are out there, without having to go back to you or use, a data scientist or someone to kind of like analyze all that stuff.
Yeah, that's a summary of it. So I think that's another point of distinction between military and government markets and, say, Facebooks of the world, where in a lot of civilian applications, the game is, how do I collect a lot of data, right? You often have business models which may not make a lot of sense because from consumer point of view, they're just getting a lot of free stuff, whether it's a free social network platform or something else, but really it's a data collection exercise.
Yeah.
Once you go into the military or government space, you cannot do that because the customer is saying, well, no, like data is ours. We don't want you to take the data.
Yep.
They do offer you collaboration, which is quite priceless in the sense of them saying, okay, we want to work with you. We're partnering with you. We want you to get better because then we get the benefit of the work. Like, for example, if you take this to the next level, we have a contract with the U.S. Department of Defense where they're actually paying us to develop our system for it to be better. So it's not just providing the data, but actually a research contract.
Yeah.
And then that's kind of the best approach you can have when the customer pays you to get you to the point where the system that you make fits their requirements. So you can't normally collect the data though. So once you've finished your partnership, the system is out in the field, a lot of the time the customer is saying, okay, I just want it to be on its own, a node learning on its own, or a network of nodes
Yeah.
learning between each other, kind of thing. And that's how information is kind of often quite sensitive information.
So if Elon Musk managed to go to Mars and he came to you and he said, "Oleg, I need some drone shields to protect us against the aliens," would you guys develop something for them? No,
Alien
I'm just saying.
threats, alien threats. Yeah, well, who knows? I mean, it's an interesting situation. You have you. I mean, we live in a world where thing about improvised threats is often that you need to build a system that is so resilient that it can manage the threats which occurred so far, but then teach itself as new threats emerge
Absolutely.
to be sort of that have future proof requirement. And also that's part of the military's mindset, where they invest in you in the long term. So a lot of it is not just, well, where are you now, but also, do you have ability to be in 10, 20 years from now where they want you to be?
Yeah, autonomy is definitely one of the key things, right? Like you want it to be independent as much as possible and give you the output or the outcomes that you want without any human interference. And that's why I kind of touch on AI, because I feel like this is absolutely where the game is in terms of being able to make sense of the data in the best way possible and real time too. So is that like, that's interesting because when you talk about utilizing data, a lot of times it's let's collect it, let's do some processing, and let's go back and run some some algorithms and see what we can make sense of it. But in your applications, all that stuff has to be done as quick as possible because you're collecting data as you're out in the field. So there's not that much time for you to come up with the right conclusions that you need to come up with.
Yes. So with the counter UAS applications, you probably have a little bit more time than with, say, a roadside bomb, because there, once the signal is traveling and detonating explosive, you have fractions of a second to do something about it. With a drone, you often have seconds, not necessarily minutes or hours, but you have a little bit of time.
Mm,
But yes, it is a time sensitive. So real time is very much a feature of what we're doing, and
mm.
latencies, and be able to report to the customer in the best possible way. And a lot of it is also just selecting what's important, right? So the trade-off is more data you forcing yourself to collect and analyze, longer the response time. So how do you get what you need, but then don't collect what you don't, because more information you get, more the sweep times are. And it's interesting. So we have these regular R&D meetings with our engineers, and you'd listen to them and they talk about milliseconds in terms of the responses, and you try to literally often shave down those to to get to the best possible result, because it may not sound like a lot of time, but one thing builds on another, and then suddenly you have a system that takes seconds rather than, say, a second to respond, and it can be critical.
So do you find that the challenge is only on that side, or is it also on the technology that collects the data and the quality of the data that it collects? So, for example, if you're, let's say, I don't know what type of data you guys collect, but you mentioned sound waves for at the start. So, um, the frequencies and being able to, for example, catch waves that are, you know, that distance apart with that sort of accuracy, is that also part of what makes what you guys do different and better, or is the game more in where you're trying to make sense of the data as quick as possible?
Maximizing the amount of data you have is gonna maximize the performance of the system, in the sense that more larger your data sets are that you're training your system on. So I'm not talking about maximizing data input when you're actually needing to protect the user, but when you're training the system, you really want to feed it more data than less, and that's across every spectrum. So acoustics, RF, optics, radar.
Yeah.
More data is generally better. But then once you have it, you have all these other things to go through. How do you tag the data? How do you analyze it in a way that is human, not human reliant? Because, well, humans are quite slow to process the data. They're quite inaccurate.
Yeah.
So how do you kind of look for those outliers in a more effective way? And that's kind of where a lot of smarts are.
Yeah. So I'm sure you know companies like Google, Amazon, AWS, Microsoft have a lot of like technologies they expose to the public and companies to use, and paid services. So the question I have is, a lot of them are very good. So do you guys partner with companies like that to improve the software that you provide, or was the strategy to make this 100% in-house, like homebred? We're going to do everything our own, and even invent new ways of coming about it.
It's a good question, and it's been an evolution for us. So when we first started with our acoustic sensors, we had some sensors which we built ourselves. Some stuff we had commercial off the shelf or COTS items, and then we had some adaptation to them, and then we used to write our own software.
Yeah.
And then as time went along, more and more of the process became custom. There are some things, for example, that we do not do and probably will never do ourselves, like, for example, batteries in our devices. I mean, we're not a battery company, we're not a Tesla.
Yeah.
So we just partner with best of breed. When you look at secure cloud, again, we're not a cloud provider. So for situations where we need a secure cloud, we partner on that front. But as we go, more and more stuff generally becomes custom, because that allows you to get maximum performance from your equipment. When, like, for example, you look at our drone guns, which is our probably what we're most well known for,
Yeah.
our handheld drone disruptors. So when the first one came along, it was about a 15-kilo device, a 5-kilo rifle, and a 10-kilo backpack. And
Wow.
some things there were custom, some things there were commercial off the shelf. In order to take this down to a 2-kilo pistol, so from 15 kilos down to 2 kilos,
Yeah.
and have more capability than the original 15-kilo device had, every little piece has to be custom. Like there's just no space for commercial off the shelf in that situation, apart from battery.
When you say custom, as in it's not mass produced, or
We would work with third parties in terms of custom machining and that kind of stuff for those to create specific components which are made just for DroneShield and nobody else.
right.
And then we would take those components. I mean, some things we actually do completely in-house ourselves. For others, you go to your network of suppliers and they would make to order your part to your own design, so to speak. So it's not just mass produced, but it's not produced for anybody else except for DroneShield.
Right. Wow. Okay. So made to order. So you guys have, for example, so it's 100% based on the demand and the orders that you guys get. So first, like you get to the point where you know exactly what it's going to look like and how it's going to work, and your partner or third party company designs it, or you guys work on the design and it gets made to the standards that you want. Then it's a matter of, okay, we got an order or we got a tender or contract that requires 10,000 of them or 500 of them, and from there it gets produced.
So the design and the development would do 100% in-house, as that's one of our strengths. Then once something is developed, you have schematics, if you like, of particular parts that we might send to our supply chain to make. So, for example, we're not going to make our own sheet metal. There are people who are much better than we would be. So we'd get certain parts, all the smarts in terms of circuit boards and chips and stuff. We actually do this ourselves.
Wow.
So then you have that hardware. So we employed our own FPGA engineers and all of that stuff kind of from the circuit board up, antenna design, etc. So you put it together. In the early days, we really used to scrap along in terms of not making stuff, not making a single unit unless it was needed for a demo or for a purchase. The problem with that was the lead times were killing us. Somebody wants something, it's like, well, I'll come back to you in a couple of months when it's ready. So now that we undertook our fairly significant capital raise about a couple months ago, that gives us, thank you, that gives us ability to invest in having a bit more demo gear and also sales gear, which is critical, because often customer comes and says, well, I want something not in 3 or 4 months, but I want this in a month. And then basically as soon as your export approvals are done, then you can do the shipment.
Yeah, because you would imagine in something like you guys do, the delivery time is something, and you've touched on this before. It's not like you go out and you're going to sell it tomorrow. First of all, you don't get a contract the very next day. It's not like you're selling a phone. But also to make it and deliver it, it's not going to be the next day as well, because the level of variance and when you, for example, if you're a phone manufacturer, you're pretty much, unless you have a couple of different models and you have, for example, a phone that is comes with a memory of 256 gigabytes and one with 128, for example. You might have a couple other things that are different. So the level of variance in the manufacturing of the product that you're selling is very minimal. Whereas in the context that you guys are in, that is completely the opposite, I'm assuming. Like, you have a lot of variance.
You try to strike the right balance. So I feel really sorry for camera manufacturers, as if you go away from sort of home security, but in the proper sort of industrial grade security, military grade market, military grade especially, it's a nightmare, because literally every camera would be custom to a particular sale. So there are just so many things you can tweak that you just cannot sell kind of off the shelf. We probably have a bit more luxury in the sense that we say, okay, we have about 10 standard products and they all come in black, funny enough. Actually, I'm sorry, some come in tan, but some come in tan, some come in black. But you really try and reduce the variance because it's a nightmare to deal with. You say to customers, sure, if you want a custom model with enough quantity, we can make this work, but you just really try to stay standard. And then on top of that, in the Five Eyes, so Five Eyes is a basically network of 5 countries, so US, Canada, UK, Australia, and New Zealand, which cooperate on the signals, that kind of intelligence front. So inside the Five Eyes market, we play the next level game, which is saying, well, rather than just selling solutions or products, we are a capability provider.
Right.
So we have knowledge to make custom solutions to meet the requirements within electronic warfare, ref sensing, sensor fusion, AI, machine learning, command and control, all of those kind of things. And then that's in many ways the most appealing market, because you go to the customer and say, tell me what your problem is. And by the way, this is a harder conversation than it sounds, because one thing is, you go to the furniture store and you're like, well, I'm looking for a couch. Military customers, especially when you're talking about vulnerabilities, are a lot more hesitant to offer you their vulnerabilities, because
there's a lot on the line.
Yeah, and they want to make sure that the information doesn't travel where it doesn't need to. So that's where you're kind of getting in the world of secret clearances and all that.
Yeah. Wow. So what are the other I mean, that industry in itself is very fascinating, but I know there's a lot of other sectors and industries that you guys are operating in, and you see a lot of need for the technology and the products that you have. So as someone who, is responsible for, I guess, like the future of the company, what are the other sectors that you're excited about and you see like a lot of potential in, and you guys are trying to push in as well?
Airports is a huge market. So you think about the economic case. I mean, now with COVID, everything is a little disrupted, but if you put that aside for a second, so if a drone is detected at an airport today, there'll be no flights. The reason why there are no flights is if a drone gets sucked into an engine of a plane, you think
It's
of
game over.
it's game over. You're going to blow out the engine. You're going to potentially ground the aircraft. A lot of people might die. So airports prefer not to take the risk, and they just say, okay, no flights until we take care of the drone. And you think of a major airport like Sydney Airport or others overseas, and we're talking millions of dollars an hour for every hour of just no flights at all during busy periods. So Gatwick in Christmas, I think it was about 2 years ago, was the most famous example where drones were flying with complete impunity over a couple of days, and they never found the pilot.
Yeah.
So that's a clear case because you have such a clear-cut economic rationale. You're sort of saying, well, if a system costs you $1 million to deploy, and for every hour that you're not flying, it costs you probably more than the cost of the system, then why wouldn't you have something like that? And our sensors are completely passive, which also goes really well for the airports because they're really sensitive about stuff that emits and interferes with other equipment. And the other thing about airports is that it's much easier to scale in that market because militaries tend to be a lot more self-focused in the sense that if you, for example, are US military and you found a product that you really like, last thing you'd want is to tell all the other militaries around the world about the product because, well, why would you? They're potentially your adversaries. While in an airport market, it's completely different. They're actually cooperating and sharing their experiences because they're not in competition anyway. So that has this ability to really scale once you deploy at a couple of airports, and we have been going through these trials at major airports in Europe over this year to really fan out. You think of amount of major, both civilian and military airports around the world, and the opportunities is quite major. There's been actually a public RFI in Australia by Air Services, which is the body in charge of counter-drone awareness, I guess you can say now, for major Australian airports that just closed that we're participating in. So it's here now, but also we're seeing a lot of interest. So FAA in the US, which is the body they are charged with counter-drone security, airports are running their own trials that our US team are involved in, and I mentioned about Europe, but we're also doing work elsewhere around the world in the airport space. But that aside, like you mentioned up front, there are a number of other sectors. So prisons, they have drones dropping off contraband, drugs, cigarettes, weapons, escape kits all the time. And even despite budgetary constraints, what I say to people is there will be the Gatwick Airport equivalent where somebody will, rather than delivering drugs, will take a drone and they'll deliver a loaded handgun, and then one of the inmates is going to take it and shoot half of the staff and a bunch of other inmates, and then prison world is going to wake up. The unfortunate thing about people's psychology is that people tend to be reactive. So I often get the kind of things like, Oleg, what do you eat for breakfast to come up with all these nightmare scenarios? But this is stuff that we see from conversations with customers around the world, and I really think it's coming. And if anything, it's surprising why there are not more incidents that have been taking place. A lot of government agencies, so in the US it'll be somebody like FBI, here it'll be Department of Home Affairs, are concerned about the terrorism threat, and there are a lot of targets, sensitive targets that have been really hardened from the ground but really exposed from the air. And we're not just talking drones delivering, like I said, drone is a delivery mechanism, it's not a threat on its own. So that could be a delivery mechanism for a explosive, but it can be a delivery mechanism for a biological or chemical weapon, really quite a range of things. And as a terrorist, you are acting with complete impunity because if the target doesn't have any way to figure out where the drone came from, well, they'll never catch you. So that's another thing about it compared to, say, traditional thing where you're driving the old truck with a bunch of explosive at the back and then you're there. Drones enable you to attack and be a perpetrator with a fair degree of impunity.
So obviously not all drones are bad, right? So there might be a kid playing with a drone just somewhere and the drone just kind of keeps going to somewhere it shouldn't go, for example. How accurate or how much of these situations you guys actually manage to not... So if out of 100 good drones, how many would you identify? Oh, no, we don't want to mess with that, or
They say it's three C's: careless, clueless, and criminal, which contribute the danger from drones. The thing is that often it doesn't matter where or who's flying the drone. Let's say a drone comes into an airport, whether it was a terrorist or a child. If it ends up bringing down an airliner, well, same end result, right?
exactly, yeah,
Doesn't matter what the intention was. So the, when we speak with our customers, it's often irrelevant who sends the drone. You have these no-fly zones, if you like, so you should not be having a drone there. Now, if you're seeing a drone, well, our devices will help you to do some kind of identification. So we can tell you, well, what kind of payload it carries. So we do AI analysis on that. Well, is it a grenade? Is it a camera? Is it a nothing?
interesting.
It can tell you what kind of drone it is. So bigger drone is usually a bigger problem. And that will allow you to come up with responses. So when you deploy a counter drone system, what we sell is it's not just about deploying hardware and you forget about it. There you have what's known in the industry as SOPs, the standard operating procedures. So you say, okay, well, I detected something. Well, what do I do now? And you have to follow particular processes, and this would be unique to each kind of a target. So a military base would have a different set of SOPs to a prison, for example. So bottom line, though, is if you detect a drone above a facility, you often have to assume the worst, and it doesn't matter who's flying it. You have to take care of the
Yep,
situation. And again, your responses will depend. If you are in Afghanistan, you have a very different type of a suggested response than if you are in a crowded stadium with lots of people. You certainly don't
of
want to
course.
start shooting at a drone or doing anything that might even trigger the payload on the drone, because then you're just doing terrorist job for them.
So interesting. So away from the security, privacy. So if we talk about privacy, I'm just kind of thinking out loud what could also be other uses for what you guys do. And I can see a case for some people who, I live in a house, I got my backyard, um, and I do not want anyone around flying the drones, checking out what I'm doing in my business, you know? Um, is there, do you see a commercial, um, I guess, use? Do you see that becoming something where you guys just sell your systems or your technology or products to just, day-to-day people who want to use it for, their own privacy protection, for example?
This introduces another dimension which is fascinating, which is legality.
Right.
So detection has its own gray elements when it comes to selling to, I guess, people like you and I.
Yeah.
Defeat is definitely cutting across quite a lot of laws which enable government and military customers to use them in particular situations, but not people like you and I. So, in a summary, a and this is again archaic legislation, right? There's no distinction between a drone and a, say, full-size aircraft. So if you are in your backyard and a drone comes, while it's the same as, say, if a helicopter will be hovering above you, you cannot take out your your gun and just start shooting at the helicopter, even if you happen to legally own a gun. And for the drone, it's the same thing. It's an aircraft owned by somebody else. The first published legal incident that I've seen on this, probably dating about 5 years ago in the US, funny enough, where a lot of people legally own firearms, where there was a Kentucky man, and he had a 17-year-old daughter who was sunbathing in the backyard, and a neighbor of his basically took a drone and was filming it. So the guy took his legally owned firearm and shoot down the drone, and the neighbor ended up suing the guy who shot it down for destruction of private property. The original owner of the firearm countersued for illegal surveillance, and then it kind of went back and forth, I think, all the way to through the court system of the U.S. I haven't
Int-
seen where it ended, but it was a very obscure case, and I think it demonstrates just how complex you have the situation was. So, for example, trespassing, again, this is law in a lot of countries, is defined as not somebody flying over your area, because I think when the laws were created, nobody considered that you can just trespass by flying over somebody's house, but physically walking on the ground. Now, if you are flying through if you are infringing via a drone, you're not actually trespassing because there's nobody involved walking on the property, so it is not a trespassing, legally speaking.
Yeah.
Then there's a question, well, who owns the airspace above your house? Now, in a lot of places, and this actually comes as a surprise to a lot of private property owners, you do not own the airspace above your property. So if a drone is hovering above your house, well, it's hovering in public space. So what are you going to do? And you would say,
we need a lawyer in this conversation.
well, yeah, you become part-time lawyer, I think, being in this industry. So as a result, what happens is the advice, unfortunately, and we get a lot of these inquiries, people say, well, a drone is outside my window. You get a lot of crazies kind of writing to you too, saying, drones are doing all these things to me. And the answer is, well, talk to the police. Unfortunately, there is not much else people can do in terms of taking matters in their own hands. You can do your own version of SOPs, standard operating procedures, where, say, if you detect a drone, well, you close the blinds, you go inside. Awareness is important. So a lot of it is not just about detection and defeat, but also being aware of the airspace around you. So if you are, if you are on a boat and you might be in a situation which you might want to be photographed in,
you're partying,
exactly.
You're doing things you're not supposed to be doing, and then
right.
someone is flying the drone from the boat next to you.
That's right. You're being photographed in a non-COVID compliant situation. Then sure, that gives you ability to respond within legal means, which often can just be go inside.
Right.
So it does give you that ability. I mean, budget is another aspect where, not so much for the VIP markets where budgets are more freely available, but our products, they do start from the order of magnitude of tens of thousands of dollars. So that does price it out for a lot of people, especially once they learn that they can't just take down the drone. And it's just a detection, which is really their main mechanism.
Wow. Cool. So talked about prisons, military, airports. What else do you guys see?
Plenty. So nuclear power stations, for example, is another one, or power stations generally. So these big cooling stacks that people think about when they think about a power station. If you are a aspiring terrorist or activist, or whichever angle you might have, all you need to do is take a drone above one of these cooling stacks. Don't even need a payload. You drop the drone into the cooling stack, and so long as somebody witnesses that, they'll probably shut down power station for a couple of weeks to conduct safety and internal investigations. Enormous inconvenience, enormous cost, potentially very large damage. So this is an example of, again, very cheap kind of threat creating enormous amount of damage.
Wow.
So we get a lot of interest from critical infrastructure in the sense of utilities, energy and power players, nuclear itself, not in Australia, but we don't have nuclear industry here, just mining, but overseas in terms of protecting those sensitive sites. Aramco in the Middle East was famously hit, and a lot of their output capability being taken out for a period of time. This is, I think, about a year and a bit ago, by Houthi rebels and their drones. So that's a very real example where you take drones with explosives on them and basically just ram them into your target, and that's very kind of high profile damage, a lot of cost.
And I'm assuming in the same way, in the manufacturing sector, especially industries like oil and gas, the heavy industries like cement, like all the industries where you have a lot of large production lines with massive equipment from turbines and things like that. I guess perhaps drones can also be a threat to them.
Totally. I mean, there is corporate espionage where you might have drones flying and collecting information via their cameras, and this can be in an industrial context, like you mentioned, or even, say, we get contacted by car manufacturers because their competitors are flying over their testing race circuits to see how the prototypes are doing. So That's another one. Or drones landing on roofs of data centers using their proximity to hack into secure networks. So again, drones, think of drone as a delivery mechanism rather than a threat itself. So just where can you place it? So danger to safety, security, and privacy is all of those situations where we have a role to play.
But how do you react to that? So let's say, because you mentioned from a legality standpoint, which I totally agree with you, you don't just have the right, unless it was a threat, and you are an organization that has the right to, counter that with shooting a drone. If I'm a car manufacturer, or if I'm someone who has this space, corporate space, I'm doing things, and my competitor's trying to spy on me with a drone, and I found out, what do I do?
So first thing is awareness, knowing when a drone is approaching, so you can have protocols to see what happens. Second thing is, and this is a fascinating feature every time I mention it to our customers, we can actually tell you where the drone came from. And by knowing that, this is not necessarily the case 100% of the time, but you can infer where the pilot is,
Right,
because usually the drone starts from the pilot.
right,
So you can actually send the security and question the pilot, which would generally achieve the right kind of outcome, especially if you are in that sort of corporate or private world.
right. So you collect enough information to help make a case. So I would, not only would I know where that pilot is, but if I knew who that person was or where they were located, I don't necessarily just have to go to them. I also have some information that I can utilize when I go to court, for example, or when I file a
Yeah,
lawsuit.
court evidence is one of the things that people use our system for. So, in addition to just real time detection, alerting, tracking, ID, we also have a quite extensive reporting suite in our software that records, here is the flight path of the drone, here is the actual footage of the camera tracking the drone, here is where it was, here is what it looks like, here are the key stats about the drone that you can then use as court evidence.
Wow, amazing. So I guess um, we dived quite a bit into what you guys do and the industries and all that stuff. Um, how do you see the next 2 3 years with, obviously 2020 has been a write-off for a lot of people, but not necessarily. Like, there's a lot of tech companies that just went through the roof. Zoom, not sure if you heard or seen, but Zoom just quadrupled, I think, once COVID kicked in. It was insane.
Oh,
Um,
it's fascinating. I actually met one of the early investors in Zoom, a VC in the US called Bill Ty, and he's on my Facebook feed. And amount of posts he's been doing about that,
yeah.
I've been keeping abreast of that. Look, good thing about being in the defense space is the requirements of the government agencies do not go away when COVID hits. A
Mm,
lot of your life is made more complex for sure. So, for example, before COVID, I used to do 6 months on the road a year, and this is not an exaggeration, going to trade conferences, demos, etc. Because a lot of the business is built on trust, and despite all the things like Zoom, people do want to see, the whites of your eyes and meet you in
of
person,
course.
so they feel they can trust you. Now I can't do that. So things are slowed down. Supply chains get disrupted, shipping gets disrupted, but the desire of the customers, or the need of the by the customers of your product, still doesn't go away. So that's certainly a better position than, say, if you own a cafe or that
Of
kind of stuff.
course.
Um, what's around the corner? So a lot of it is continuing to iterate and come up with products that meet requirements of our customers. So we are thankful in a position now where we have this dialogue as a trusted supplier, where the customer says, well, this is great, but can I have this with this kind of slight tweak? And we just continue to refine it. And the great thing about it is, when one customer says, I want it to be done like in this particular way, usually it's an improvement for every other customer as well, if you do that. Some things you can't necessarily implement for others, and people are sensitive about the changes, so you just have to manage this. But you continue to improve what you have. Then, as I mentioned, we are taking our skill set as a counter drone supplier, which at the end of the day is a very niche thing, right? Like I think
Super niche.
for a lot of people, when they haven't heard of a counter drone, they'll be like, wow, this is an amazing industry. Kind of makes sense, but so niche. Um, and you're saying, well, what about taking your skill set and applying it more broadly? So, well, counter drone is it's a flying RF emitter, but you can do the same thing to detect enemy radios or any other things which emit RF energy. Or the moment you can reliably detect flying objects at they fly 20 meters a second and in 3 dimensions, kind of white drone against white sky, and be able to reliably ID and not just the drone but the payload as well, and track it. Well, what else can you do? Can you use that optics knowledge to apply it to targets in other sectors? So becoming more of a sensing technology or sensor and affected company that can work with customers that we already have and a kind of adjacent customers to deliver solutions in that sort of uh, improvised threat space.
Yeah, I was just gonna go to that space. So essentially, you can just keep growing into a company that provides protection against different objects, and it doesn't have to be just drone. Or is the focus, regardless of how big you guys go, is to protect just against drones and remain in that space?
Despite the name DroneShield, we are open-minded,
Yeah.
and I think there are some large opportunities outside of the drone space that our technologies can be relevant in. So we briefly touched on the counter IED, which is an example of an adjacent space. There are a number of other potential emerging threats. So we definitely can look at other things, and we already are, and we're getting close to securing our initial contracts in spaces completely unrelated to drones with various militaries. So it's more about becoming capability provider, where you say, hey, I have ability to understand your problem and create a solution that fixes that problem. So having that conversation and creating solutions which help make life our customers a bit easier. So that's kind of what's around the corner. So yeah, we're about a 40-person company now. Uh, we're continuing to grow. Thing about being in Australia is that you have that access to world-class talent, and competition is perhaps not as tough as you have in the US. You're not competing with the likes of Silicon Valley and the enormous defense industry that the US
We're
has.
even better than them, mate.
So that's actually really good. I mean, in like in Australia, I mean, I genuinely think that for an engineer of the types that we're looking for, we are probably just about the most exciting employer one can imagine. You're working on real problems. You're working in a much shorter time frames. So there are a lot of conversations about fintech. Well, we consider ourselves like a dev tech or defense technology company. So you kind of a bit of a disruptor in a way. I mean, we work with big defense primes as well, but part of our offering is that agility, delivering products quickly, kind of not messing about. So on one hand, you are a well-funded, well-resourced company, so you have ability to make stuff happen, but at the same time, you don't have as much of red tape and bureaucracy that really large companies are constrained by.
Wow. And in terms of capability, and finding talent, obviously you guys have an edge, but do you find that it is perhaps at times challenging to find the right people? Because it's not just the how risky what you do and what you promise and how important that is and critical, but also, um, so you not only do you need the technical abilities, but you also need people you can trust. There's a large, there's a large range of things that you need to have in the person. Whereas, like, if I'm just a SaaS company, like a software as a service company, it's not as risky. It's not as I guess tough to find the right person.
Totally. And that's one of the hardest things about it. And the good thing is it's easier to find 10 engineers for a 40-person company than if you're at Atlassian and you have thousands of engineers, and like you hear these horror stories about people maxing out on their immigration visa allowances with the Department of Home Affairs because they just physically do not have ability to find engineers here. Then they go overseas, then they get maxed out on that. So you just keep hitting limit after limit. We thankfully are not at the point like that.
It would be a good problem to have.
Yeah. Well, speaking of Bezos, I'm a big fan of his, and one of the things he talks
Shout
about.
out to Bezos if you're watching.
He talks about day zero mentality that you probably know. So you
what
have
mentality is that?
Day zero mentality. Okay. So you have to treat every day as a day zero. So what often happens is as people get going and the business is growing, standards tend to slip. Say you might have first 10 employees being really high quality, but that's relatively easy to find. But then try to go find another 1,000 and much harder to keep the standards. So the idea is that with each new round of hires, you want to raise the standard rather than drop the standard.
Yep.
And that's actually kind of hard because on one hand, you have this pressure to keep increasing the size of the team to keep momentum, but on the other hand, you have to keep your standards. And so I come from investment banking background before I got into defense, and talent is a key part. I mean, that's kind of all you have at the end of the day, talent and capital when you are working in a bank. And it's fascinating. You kind of say, well, how do you build and maintain the culture of high performance where people have that extreme ownership of where they are, and they really kind of work their guts off because they love what they do.
I was just going to say that. So one of the things you probably don't have to deal with that much versus other companies is having people who are intrinsically driven and motivated about what they do. Because it's such a niche thing that if I'm doing it, it's not because I'm doing it because I'm getting paid. Obviously that comes with it, but you must love what you do if you're an engineer who works in your company. I couldn't imagine being someone who's qualified enough to do something like that, and not being like, I guess bookworm since I was a kid, like really into that stuff or whatever. But the idea is the level of natural self-motivation that you would have with people that work in your company is probably going to be a lot higher than many others. So that's kind of like the upside, I think. Was that inaccurate?
No, that's completely accurate. So you want to feel that you're not, your employer doesn't shaft you, so you're getting paid a competitive salary. But beyond that, I'd say you don't necessarily go into a company like ours to maximize your short-term earnings. You go and you work in a maybe for a bank or something like that. You do this because you love the industry. I mean, the good thing about us is we have all the excitement of being a fundamentally defense company, but then you don't have that moral burden, say, if you'd be making machine guns that kill people, because our story is basically saving lives. Yep. So you can have the best of both worlds. You're solving cutting edge problems. So we compete on global stage, and products we make have to be not just the best in Australia, but best globally. Otherwise, you don't win the prize. And I think a lot of engineers are quite proud of what they are.
Of course, rightly often, so.
Yeah. And we just that ability of saying, okay, well, let's take a concept and turn it into real product in no time. And also we make sure that everybody gets a chance to spend time at the front line, so to speak. I find it's fascinating where I think in a lot of places engineers tend to kind of get shafted at the back of the room and they never get to see the customer. We often have engineers front facing towards the customers, and there's no, I guess, better reward often for an engineer when a general might say, we love this product and this is exactly what we're looking for. And this kind of stuff is what makes them as excited about the job as they are.
That's very smart. So engineers in a lot of ways are front facing, not just at the back end. Interesting. Because I don't think that's quite common, like with all tech companies. Normally engineers are just sitting at the back, doing the work, but they don't get these rewarding moments when they, you know, if it's a B2B, they sit down with the clients and, you know, um, hear nice things from them or thanks or whatever, or be acknowledged in a big room. So that's really cool. Um, it has been an eventful hour, probably a little bit more. I'm sure there's probably another 5 hours that we can do, but I'm conscious of your time. Um, so I want to thank you so much for coming in here. It's been a pleasure. I've learned a lot. I'm sure everyone watching also will find a lot of cool, interesting um, things in what we talked about. If anyone watching and they want to get in touch for a business reason or just connect with you, what would be the best way? LinkedIn? Um,
LinkedIn, I'll probably just my email. So oleg.vornik@droneshield.com, oleg.vornik@droneshield.com. I welcome on feedback and thoughts.
and let's get some followers to the LinkedIn page as well. What's the LinkedIn page?
So
DroneShield?
Drone Shield is just the name of the page. So everybody's welcome to follow. We try to post our news and industry news as well. So we have trying to remember, I think we have maybe about 5,000 followers now. So it
I
keeps
think so.
growing.
Yeah. Awesome. Amazing. Well, thank you so much.
Thanks, Rani.